May 9, 1942, Cabanatuan, the Philippines. The air hung heavy with disinfectant and dust, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Inside Barrack 12, Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Haines sat cross-legged on a mat made of rice sacks, the bamboo floor flexing under his weight. His skin gleamed with fever sweat. Around him, a chorus of shallow breathing filled the room. Men too tired to sleep, too weak to talk. The stench of mildew, smoke, and unwashed bodies clung to the heat like a second skin. He adjusted his dog tags, the metal almost too hot to touch, and reached for what little remained of a pencil. The wood was splintered, the graphite worn to a nub. In his other hand, he held a torn page, the corner of a Japanese supply ledger stolen from the camp clerk's hut. The page smelled faintly of kerosene and mold, but to Bobby it was worth more than food. He hesitated before writing. The sound of boots outside reminded him that letters were forbidden. Any written word could be seized and burned. But something inside him refused the silence. Maybe it was the memory of Oregon, the rain-drenched pines, the porch light that always glowed yellow against the night. Maybe it was her, the girl who wrote once a week until the mail stopped coming. He steadied his shaking hand and began, "My darling, if this ever reaches you, know that I am still myself, though the world around me has come undone." He stopped, listening. A guard shouted somewhere down the path, his words sharp, almost metallic. The prisoners outside shuffled into formation for the evening count. Inside, Bobby's pencil scratched faintly over paper, the sound swallowed by the humid air. He wrote about things that still felt alive. The smell of her hair when it rained, the sound of the river near her house, the promise that he would come home before Christmas. He didn't mention the dysentery, the hunger, or the men who disappeared each morning and never returned from the burial detail. The light dimmed to orange as the sun dropped behind the hills. Shadows of barbed wire stretched long across the camp yard. From somewhere beyond the fence, a radio crackled with foreign voices, fragments of a world still moving. A whisper came from the cot beside him. "Still writing, Bobby?" He turned. It was Corporal Dean, his voice barely a rasp. "Yeah," Bobby murmured. "Just a note." Dean managed a faint smile. "Make it a good one." The pencil tip broke. Bobby pressed harder, drawing a thin gray scar across the paper. He folded the sheet carefully, smoothing the edges with his thumb, then twice again until it fit into his palm. The barrack creaked as men shifted in their sleep. The mosquitoes whined around the lantern flame. Outside, a Japanese guard walked past, rifle slung low, his silhouette framed by the moonlight filtering through the bamboo slats. For a second, Bobby saw something human in the way the man stopped, not watching, just listening to the rain starting in the distance. When the footsteps faded, Bobby lifted a loose plank beside his mat and slid the folded letter beneath it. He pressed the wood back down, sealing the words in darkness. He knew it would likely rot there. Dampness would take it before freedom ever could. But the act of hiding it felt like defiance, like proof that a part of him still belonged somewhere else. He whispered into the night, not praying, not pleading, just speaking to a name carried in his mind across the ocean. "Tomorrow," he said softly. "I'll send it tomorrow." Outside, the count whistle blew. A guard barked orders in clipped syllables, and the camp stirred again, caught between exhaustion and obedience. The candle flickered once, then died, leaving only the glow of the sky pressing through bamboo walls, and in that darkness, the letter waited, silent, unfinished, alive. By mid-June, the camp had become a machine of monotony, a rhythm of pain so precise that even suffering found routine. The men rose before dawn to the shrill sound of whistles and the shouted command, "Tenko," Roll call. They stood barefoot in mud, counted again and again until numbers replaced names. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was a ladle of watery rice and the sour smell of boiled greens. In those hours before the heat turned cruel, Bobby learned to disappear, to move, speak, breathe in ways that drew no attention. Captivity demanded silence as a kind of armor, but inside that silence words kept pushing against the edges of his mind, pressing for release. Every night, when the guards' voices faded, he whispered phrases to himself, lines he would later write when no one was watching. On the third morning of July, a new voice entered the camp's rhythm. The interpreter. He wore thin spectacles, his uniform pressed but faded, his tone neither harsh nor kind. Sergeant Nakamura. His English was careful, deliberate, the sort of voice that had once studied poetry before war taught it to count bodies instead. He stood beside the guard tower, translating orders for the prisoners, work assignments, rations, punishments. His words came out even, restrained, stripped of intent. But when he passed Bobby's group, he hesitated just long enough for a glance to register. Not authority, not threat. Recognition. Later that day, during inspection, Nakamura entered Barrack 12 for the first time. He paused near Bobby's mat, the floorboards darkened from months of humidity. His shadow fell across the spot where the letter lay hidden. Bobby's pulse kicked in his chest. The interpreter crouched, his boots creaking, eyes scanning the corners of the room. A hush fell. The men around him stared straight ahead. The unspoken code of captivity. See nothing, say nothing. Nakamura brushed his hand over the floor, his fingertips pausing on the slight rise of the plank. He lifted it. Dust drifted into the lantern light. Beneath it lay the folded paper. Bobby didn't move. He expected a shout, a blow, the commandant's fury. Instead, Nakamura looked at the paper for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then slipped it into his pocket and stood. Inspection complete, he said softly, and left. That night, Bobby didn't sleep. He watched the door, waiting for guards to burst in, for punishment to follow. The letter had been everything. His voice, his defiance, the last fragile thread to the world beyond the wire. Losing it felt like losing himself, but when dawn came, he found something he didn't expect. Beneath his rice bowl sat a folded scrap of paper. The same paper, the same handwriting, untouched. He unfolded it, hands trembling. The words were smudged but still legible. On the back, in neat Japanese characters, someone had written one small word, safe. He looked up, scanning the yard through the slats in the wall. Nakamura was there, clipboard in hand, reading names in a flat, formal tone. Their eyes met for the briefest instant, and in that moment, Bobby understood. The man had chosen to protect him, to protect the letter. No words passed between them after that, but an invisible line connected them. Two men separated by language, by allegiance, yet bound by something wordless. As the day wore on, the heat grew punishing. The guards barked orders and prisoners stumbled through work details. Shoulders burned and blistered. When the count ended, Bobby returned to the barrack, collapsed beside his mat, and touched the letter once more, the one thing that had survived both discovery and mercy. Outside, the cicadas screamed in the trees, their endless song rising over the barbed wire. Inside, Bobby whispered the word he had read in the handwriting of his enemy, safe, as if saying it might make it true. The days that followed bled together until they lost their edges. One long stretch of light and heat and labor. The routine was both punishment and mercy. Punishment because it never stopped. Mercy because within it, the mind could hide. Every morning before sunrise, the guard's boots struck the gravel. and the camp stirred into motion. The prisoners lined up barefoot in the mud, eyes half closed, waiting for the familiar call. Tenko. The sound of bamboo sticks clacking against helmets punctuated each count. No one ever knew if the numbers matched the bodies, but no one corrected the guards anymore. Accuracy wasn't the point. Bobby's hands had grown raw from hauling logs and buckets. His uniform, once crisp and olive, had faded to a nameless brown. The fever came and went, leaving behind chills that rattled his bones. But the letter, the folded piece of paper under the floor, remained dry, untouched, somehow immune to time. He learned to ration everything, food, strength, even memory. When he worked in the clearing detail, he kept his mind busy by counting steps, trees, breaths. When the guards shouted, he answered in monotone. When they hit, he flinched once and moved on. Survival meant becoming invisible, and yet there were moments when humanity slipped through. One evening, after a week of monsoon rain, the guards permitted the men to wash near a drainage ditch. The water was brown and warm, but it was freedom for 5 precious minutes. As Bobby rinsed his face, he looked up and saw Nakamura standing on the embankment, his uniform damp from rain, watching quietly. Their eyes met. Nakamura nodded once, almost imperceptibly. In his hand, he held a small rice ball wrapped in paper. When the others turned away, he dropped it near Bobby's discarded shirt and walked off without a word. Bobby stared at the food, plain, cold, miraculous. He waited until the others left, then took a single bite and buried the rest in the mud, afraid the men would fight for it if they saw. He said nothing, but that night, when he lay back down, he wrote another line beneath the letter's last words. I met a man who doesn't know my name, but he kept me alive today. Each night he added a few more sentences, writing in the faint light of a stolen candle stub. The pencil was worn so thin that he used a sliver of wood to extend it, wrapping it in thread to hold. When the lead broke, he lit the candle just long enough to soften it before continuing. Around him, men whispered dreams of home, of food, of the smell of clean sheets. The chaplain murmured prayers under his breath until his voice cracked. The sound became part of the night, like the chorus of insects or the wind pressing through bamboo walls. Bobby began teaching the younger soldiers how to tap messages on the wall, a crude Morse made of knocks. 3 short taps for alive, 2 for food, 1 for help. When the guards passed by, the sound stopped, then resumed after silence returned. It was a rhythm of hope, thin, stubborn, human. Weeks passed. The fever returned, worse this time. He worked slower, the world around him blurring into light and sound. He dreamed of home, the creak of the porch swing, the smell of wet pine, dreams that felt too clear to be only memory. One evening, a storm swept through the valley. Rain hammered the roof, leaking through cracks, turning the floor to slick mud. The candle flickered, went out, and the barrack filled with the rhythm of the storm. Bobby lifted the floorboard once more, checking the letter. It was damp but intact. He spread it out on his mat, using the heat from his hands to dry the edges. He read the words again, tracing them with a trembling finger. The lines were fading now, the graphite smudged by time and sweat, but each one carried a heartbeat. He pressed his palm flat against the page and whispered, I'm still here. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains. The camp slept, and the letter, fragile, damp, defiant, waited for a dawn that never seemed to come. By late summer, the air inside Cabanatuan grew thicker than breath. Heat, rot, and human closeness fused into one. The rainy season had passed, leaving behind puddles that never dried and flies that never left. Disease moved through the camp like fog, slow and invisible. Men counted days by the number of funerals. That was when a new rule arrived, written in both Japanese and English, nailed to the mess hall post. All unauthorized writing and possession of paper will be punished by death. The interpreter, Sergeant Nakamura, read it aloud in his careful, almost apologetic tone. His eyes stayed low as he translated the words, avoiding the faces that looked back at him. He had no choice. The new commandant, Captain Tanaka, was not a man of patience. Tanaka's presence changed everything. He was broad-shouldered, perpetually calm, and spoke softly, which somehow made him more terrifying. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The guards obeyed him with an edge of fear. Within a week of his arrival, 2 men were executed for keeping a diary. That night, the barracks fell into a silence so deep it felt physical. Even the tapping messages on the walls stopped. Words themselves had become dangerous. Bobby knew he should destroy the letter. He had rewritten parts of it so many times the paper had softened to near tissue. But he couldn't. It was more than a message. It was proof of the man he used to be. He lay awake, listening to the hum of mosquitoes and the faint clatter of boots outside. In the next barrack, someone coughed until it turned into a moan. The night smelled of sweat and rain-soaked wood. When the lantern light appeared at the doorway, Bobby froze. Tanaka's voice came first, a sharp command, followed by Nakamura's translation. Inspection. Contraband. The guards overturned mats, ripped apart bundles of clothing. A bayonet tip struck the bamboo floor inches from Bobby's hidden plank. He didn't move. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure they could hear it. Then, from the doorway, Nakamura stepped inside. His expression was neutral, his posture perfect. He glanced toward Bobby, a flash of recognition, so brief it might have been imagined, then knelt to inspect the same spot as before. Bobby's throat tightened. This time, there would be no mercy. Tanaka's shadow filled the doorway behind him, watching. Nakamura's hand reached beneath the mat. The wood creaked. His fingers brushed the paper. He paused. 1 second, 2, then withdrew his hand, empty. He turned back toward the captain. "Nothing here," he said in Japanese. His voice did not waver. Tanaka grunted, gestured toward the next barrack, and stepped away. The guards followed. Only when the lantern light faded did Nakamura look back. For an instant his expression broke, not fear, but something closer to grief. He gave the smallest nod, then left. Hours later, as the camp slept, Nakamura returned alone. He knelt by Bobby's mat once more, his hands shaking now. He lifted the floorboard, retrieved the letter, and slipped it into his own satchel. Outside, the rain began again, thin, steady, rhythmic against the tin roof. He stood there a moment, watching the droplets fall through the light of his lantern. He could burn it. He should. But he didn't. Instead, he pressed the envelope against his chest, beneath the folds of his uniform, and whispered in his own language, words Bobby would never hear, a prayer, perhaps, or an apology. In that moment, the camp still slept, unaware that a single act of disobedience had just taken place, one that defied both war and command. The letter, once a secret of survival, had become something greater, an act of shared humanity between 2 men forbidden to see each other as human at all. By August, Cabanatuan no longer resembled a camp, but a shadow of one, a place where breath itself seemed borrowed. The monsoon heat had returned, heavy and unmoving, pressing down on the men who lay sprawled beneath the barracks. The smell was unbearable. Sweat, infection, and smoke from the burning pits beyond the wire. Bobby could barely sit up. His fever had climbed higher each night, and his vision wavered in and out of focus. The malaria came in waves, chills, then burning heat, then a strange floating calm, as if his body had already started to forget it existed. He no longer wrote, the letter was gone, and the pencil had been taken, but his hands still traced words on the mat, as if the act alone could bring the paper back. The men around him, fewer now, quieter, whispered his name. One pressed a hand to his shoulder and said, "Sleep, Bobby. Just sleep." He smiled weakly. "Can't," he murmured. "She's waiting on a letter." The words made no sense to them, but they didn't correct him. In war, the mind made its own sanctuary. At midday, the guards called for another inspection. Tanaka moved through the rows of prisoners like a specter, saying little. Behind him came Nakamura, the clipboard trembling slightly in his hands. His eyes swept the barracks, stopping at the spot where Bobby lay. Later, when the others had been sent out to work detail, Nakamura returned alone. He carried a small canteen of water, half full, and a folded envelope, Japanese stationery, ivory-colored, marked with a red imperial crest. Bobby's eyes flickered open. He saw the figure kneeling beside him and struggled to speak. His lips were cracked, his breath shallow. "I kept it," Nakamura whispered, the words hesitant, unsure if Bobby could understand. "Safe. Always." He placed the envelope beside him and lifted his head to help him drink. Bobby took a single swallow before coughing. His voice came out hoarse, nearly gone. "For you," he said slowly, each word torn from his throat. If I can't, keep it safe. For me." Nakamura froze. He wanted to say something, to explain that he couldn't send it, that even keeping it was a crime. But no words formed. All he could do was bow his head. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, though the sky above was still cloudless. The season was changing, but the war was not. That night, the fever worsened. Bobby spoke to no one, eyes open but unfocused. The chaplain came, too weak to kneel, and whispered a prayer over him, his voice trembling. Some of the men turned away, others stared silently, knowing they would be next. Just before dawn, Bobby's breathing slowed. He reached out once, as if to grasp the air, then went still. The silence afterward was absolute, the kind that made even the guards stop shouting for a moment. When the sun rose, Nakamura was the one who carried the body. He refused to let the guards toss it into the pit. Instead, he found a small patch of ground near the edge of the clearing, a place where the light reached through the trees. He buried Bobby there himself, marking the spot with a bamboo cross made from scrap wood. No name, no ceremony, just soil, sunlight, and silence. Before covering the grave, he pulled the letter from his satchel. It was worn from handling, the edges darkened by sweat and time. He slipped it into a fresh envelope and sealed it with wax from a candle stub. On the front, in black ink, he brushed a single kanji, Shin, Kokoro, the heart. He stood there a moment longer, the envelope pressed to his chest, the morning insects beginning to stir. Then he tucked it into the lining of his uniform between his orders and his identification papers, where no one would think to look. By noon, the camp was alive again. The same sounds, the same shouts, the same motions of obedience. But something small had shifted. One man's words now traveled with another, across lines of war, across a divide that no command could dictate. For the first time in weeks, Nakamura looked up at the sky and realized how bright it was. Tokyo, 1978. The war had been over for more than 3 decades, but its paper trails were still unfolding, dusty, crumbling, infinite. In the basement of the Defense Ministry archives, the hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence where ghosts might have spoken if they'd had tongues left. Professor Kenji Sato adjusted his glasses and opened another storage box. The cardboard was soft, edges eaten by time. Inside were lists typed on onion skin paper, brittle photographs and envelopes bound by faded twine. The box label read, Cabanatuan, Luzon, Correspondence 1942-45. He leafed through camp rosters and supply memos until one envelope caught his eye. It was different, thicker paper, sealed with wax that had cracked to dust. Across the front was a single brushstroke, Shin. The ink had bled slightly, still black after all these years. Sato lifted the flap carefully as though touching something alive. Inside, folded neatly in quarters, was a page written in English. The handwriting was small, slanted, disciplined, the kind of writing taught in American schools before the war. He read the first line aloud, softly, in accented English. My darling, if this ever reaches you, know that I am still myself, though the world around me has come undone. The air seemed to thicken. Sato read on, slowly, translating phrases under his breath. It was not a confession, not a soldier's report. It was a love letter written from the edge of annihilation. The name at the bottom was half-faded but legible enough. Lieutenant Robert Haines, U.S. Army Air Corps. Sato leaned back in his chair. He had read hundreds of military documents, orders, testimonies, execution reports, but never something like this. A letter unsent, preserved not by chance, but by will. Someone had meant for it to survive. He traced the American's name through Red Cross prisoner lists. There it was. Entry number 1174. Haines Robert J., captured April 1942, died August 1942, Cabanatuan. The next of kin was listed as Elizabeth Haines, Portland, Oregon. Sato hesitated, then picked up his fountain pen. On a fresh sheet, he wrote a note. Simple, direct, almost apologetic. To whom it may concern, I have found a letter belonging to Lieutenant Robert Haines, a prisoner of war in the Philippines. It appears to have been preserved by a Japanese officer during the war. I believe it should be returned to his family. He sealed it, attached a translation, and sent it through the embassy channel. 3 months later, in Salem, Oregon, a letter arrived at the state archives. The parcel was unremarkable. Plain brown paper, Japanese stamps, official routing marks. Inside, wrapped in tissue, lay the same folded sheet that had crossed neither ocean nor battlefield during its time, but now had traveled across decades. When the archivist called the listed family contact, it was not Elizabeth who answered. She had died years earlier, but her younger sister, Margaret. She was 74 and still kept her brother's photograph on her dresser. Margaret arrived the next day. She wore a gray wool coat despite the late summer heat. Her hands trembled as she signed the visitor log. The archivist led her to a quiet room where a single folder waited beneath soft light. She opened it slowly. The handwriting was faint, smudged by time, but the words lived. She recognized his phrasing instantly, formal, careful, always polite. As she read, her lips trembled once, then pressed shut. She reached the line about Oregon, about rain and pine, and stopped. Outside the window, a freight train passed, the low hum carrying across the Willamette River like a distant heartbeat. She folded the page again, the same way he once had, and held it to her chest. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. He kept his promise, she said. The archivist asked what she meant. She didn't answer. She just smiled faintly and looked toward the light filtering through the window blinds. Later, when she left, she donated the letter to the state's permanent collection, requesting only one note on the record, for those who never came home, but never disappeared. In Tokyo, Professor Sato filed his final report. His handwriting was neat, the last line concise. One letter returned to America. New Orleans, present day. Inside the National World War II Museum, the air is cool and dry, humming softly with the sound of filtered ventilation. The exhibit hall is dim, the light angled low, guiding visitors through corridors of glass and memory. At the far end of the gallery, behind a single pane of glass and a brass placard, lies a letter. The paper is thin and yellowed, its edges curled slightly, like the wing of a leaf that's forgotten how to close. Faint graphite lines stretch across it, uneven but deliberate. Beneath it, a simple caption reads, Lieutenant Robert J. Haines, U.S. Army Air Corps, Cabanatuan POW Camp, 1942. A woman stands in front of the case. She doesn't take a photo, she just watches. Behind her, the audio guide narrates softly, the voice of an actor reading Bobby's words, calm and steady. My darling, if this ever reaches you, know that I am still myself. The recording trails off into silence, leaving the faint buzz of the lights above. For a moment, the visitor doesn't hear the museum around her. The murmuring crowds, the footsteps, the guides explaining strategy and aircraft models. She hears only the stillness that lives inside the glass. A reflection glides across the case, her face overlapping the letter, the present folding gently over the past. The graphite catches the light briefly, as though the words might still breathe. At night, when the museum closes, the lights dim to a soft gray glow for preservation. The night guard passes through, pausing here as he always does. He swears sometimes the air shifts, that the letter lifts slightly when the vents hum on, as if it remembers being folded by human hands. He never reports it. Some things aren't meant to be explained. Every few months, the letter is examined by conservators, gloves on, breath held, then returned to its case. Visitors leave notes in a small box nearby, messages of gratitude, apology, love. Many simply say, thank you. Across the ocean, in Tokyo, an identical copy rests in another glass case. The same words preserved in a smaller exhibit at the Peace Documentation Center. The display is minimal, just the letter, the wax seal, and the character Shin, handwritten beneath the English translation. Heart. A plaque nearby reads, Recovered from Ministry Archives, 1978, preserved by an unidentified officer, donated in the spirit of reconciliation. Japanese students visit the exhibit on field trips. Most walk past without lingering. Some stop. One young man, reading English haltingly, whispers the first line aloud. When he finishes, he bows slightly before leaving. Between these two rooms, one in America, one in Japan, the same silence hums. It is not the silence of forgetting, but of recognition. The camera would linger here. On the paper, the reflection, the light shifting from morning to night. Then it would drift outward, across the ocean, over water as still as glass, following the letter's imagined path, the one it never took. No narration now, only sound, a faint rustle, the turning of a page, then quiet again. Somewhere in the background, a faint voice, not an actor, not a soldier, just a man speaking to no one. If this ever reaches you, the words dissolve into air. And for a long, unbroken moment there is nothing, only the still frame of a folded letter that crossed oceans not by mail, but by mercy. The image fades to black,